The novelty of the undertaking immediately strikes us. It has been shown that the other confederacies which could be consulted as precedents have been vitiated by the same erroneous principles, and can therefore furnish no other light than that of beacons, which give warning of the course to be shunned without pointing out that which ought to be pursued. The words of James Madison. That Madison is a wordy, contradictory fellow, but there are some places where he really nailed it in the Federalist Papers. The United States is and always will be the world's oldest functioning democracy. This is very cool in every way except for one. It meant that in setting up the United States government, there was no blueprint for success. When a Balkan nation today declares its independence, or we liberate Iraq, or protesters oust a dictator in Egypt, there's a whole consulting team of constitutional scholars who can give input as to what the best practices are for sustainable democratic republics. No such beast existed at the time that the Constitution was being written. All there were, as Madison so wonderfully put it, were beacons, lighthouses, things that hadn't worked in the past. Because while we are the oldest functioning democracy, we're far from the first group of lunatics to try it. We could tie it to the Edison quote about not failing, but rather finding ways to not make light bulbs. Well, here they are. These are the beacon lights, the myriad ways in which democratic regimes had failed before we succeeded. The Greeks, as we well know, contributed many things to our society, such as olives, gyros, Lenny Kravitz, and most importantly for our studies here, democracy. We often cite Greek democracy as being the first human experiment in democracy, but as students of history we also know that that democracy did not last. In fact, it was not even all of Greece that was governed democratically. Our school namesake of Sparta was much too busy enjoying the company of younger men and wounding babies to experiment with such trivial nonsense. It was the city-state of Athens in the 5th century BC that we can look at as the cradle of democracy. Athens was governed by direct democracy by all citizens, but it's important that we get that asterisk in there reminding us that citizens was not the broad definition it is today, and really only applied to a small group of Athenian males. So, while not being a governmental system that we realize, and while not being one that's particularly egalitarian, the Athenian democracy suffered from a number of other problems too. Not the least of which being that its primary achievement was perpetuating a rigid class structure for its time period. The distinction between citizen and non-citizens grew greater, and the democratic governmental structure became a way for the ruling class to advance their own self-interests. Remember back to Aristotle's chart of governments from the first week of class, and remember which side he had democracies on. Democracy is, in the eyes of the Greeks, the masses ruling in their own interests, not in the interests of the group, but the masses ruling to advance the interests of the ruling masses. Ultimately, falling to invasion, the democracy found itself completely ill-equipped to deal with the Persian problem, but probably its longest and most enduring problem was that the unchecked will of the majority became tyrannical. The Athenian democracy, while getting points for originality, really only succeeds in advancing the interests of its own upper-class citizens and in killing its own philosophers. So we'll skip ahead to a much longer-lasting experiment in democracy, the Romans. Rome's Republic is where we get the namesake for one house of our current national legislature, the Senate, but it too is far from a glimmering example of what democracy is supposed to be. Rome suffered from a similar struggle with class structure with the patricians and plebeians, and like in Greek democracy, it had a very difficult time dealing with crises such as foreign invasions. The Romans, not wanting to suffer the same fate as the Athenians then, ended up suspending the democracy in times of conflict, a solution that, while self-preserving, hopefully strikes us as problematic if the true goal is meaningful, constant political representation. Keep these democratic defects in mind. The Greeks struggled with managing freedom in the time of crisis. The Romans found themselves unable to resist charismatic leaders such as Caesar, such as Augustus. both skewed towards their upper classes. When I say that these are the glaciers or the rocks that the Titanic experiment known as American democracy has needed to miss, I'm not exaggerating or speaking in hypotheticals. These are the very real issues that governments have needed to navigate over the course of time. Venice of the early modern period gives us actually the world's longest experiment with democracy, a little fun regarded fun fact of history. The Venetians, for over a millennium, had a democratic system where various democratically elected legislatures worked in cooperation with a ruler called the Doge to manage city affairs. Now, the Doge was given pretty much free rein to disregard this legislative body, so we see that if one branch of government has the power to run amok, it can only go so far as a successful example of a functioning democracy according to Montesquieu and according to basic American principles, especially if that branch is the one that is defined by an unelected figure such as the Doge. And we'll also see that when the stuff hits the fan in Venice, Venice was notoriously poor at putting up resistance and notoriously good at getting looted. But this system worked for Venice's economic elites for a mighty long time before it collapsed due to its dependence on the wealthy remaining happy, which wealthy only do if their wealth is continuing to grow. Once trade opened up to more of Europe and Venice lost its special role as the lone cosmopolitan trading post, democratic harmony disappeared in favor of an iron grip on the part of the Doge, and ultimately the whole thing would be gobbled up into a newly formed Italy some 60 years later. Having a wealthy population with a stake in the well-being of society seems to be one of the things that you need in order to make a democracy go. So it's not a surprise then that the other major European power to serve as a beacon for us is the wealthy Dutch provinces. The Dutch system of government from 1581 up until 1795 probably goes understated in American history, given that it was the closest thing that we had to a template to be working from. The Dutch system of federalism, that is to say, a system in which states were allowed to administrate themselves while being a part of a larger collective, which the framers of the US Constitution would ultimately end up emulating. But just like the Venetians, it had a difficult time checking who had a difficult time checking the Doge. The Dutch office of the stadholder, the chief executive, also was able to operate fairly unchecked. Furthermore, of these provinces, some were wealthy enough that the former region is informally named after them in the case of Holland, and some were poor enough that they weren't allowed to vote and didn't have representation, as is the case with Dutch Arkansas here. So, if we're looking for functioning democracy, we're going to need to look somewhere other than the Europeans. Maybe we can look to our own nation's history. After all, there had been colonies on this continent for well over 200 years at the time of the framing of the Constitution. Maybe there was something to learn, something to glean from their governments. Probably the most democratic of all the colonial governments was the legislature of Pennsylvania. Unlike other states, which had invested great power in their royal governors, the Pennsylvanians had a constitution that vested most of its legitimate authority with its legislature. A legislature that required that all of its members serve single-year terms of office. It doesn't get much more democratic than everyone's going to get a turn to rule sooner or later. But this too had its flaws, possibly because of how democratic it was. With new officers coming in every single year, first of all, you were dealing with an inexperienced leadership, but more to the point, you were allowing whatever issues the citizens were angry about at the time to completely dominate a new session of the legislature. Citizens have fleeting concerns, and if you let them get their reactionary way all of the time, you'll end up with a society that ends up suffering from a new kind of tyranny. One that bounces back and forth between extremes and makes for a very contentious political situation. All of this is to say that we didn't have a roadmap for where we were going when the framers were shaping the Constitution. But we knew what mines in the minefield we didn't want to hit. We also knew where we were, and we weren't particularly big fans of that either. From the time period of the Declaration of Independence to the time of the framing of the U.S. Constitution, the United States were governed under the Articles of Confederation. Probably the best way to get a quick and dirty sense of the Articles of Confederation is to do this simple Google image search, and the helpful people at Google will immediately suggest, did you mean the problems with the Articles of Confederation? That seems to be what a lot of people are wanting to focus on. The problems of the Articles of Confederation. And why shouldn't they? The Articles of Confederation were weak. They did not allow the government to tax. The executive branch was little more than a title of president given to the person who was stuck conducting tours of Congress. The officers received no pay, which effectively made them puppets of the state legislatures who appointed them. And worst of all, there was no legitimate way to amend the darn things, because that required the unanimous consent of all 13 colonies, and several colonies went underrepresented, or completely unrepresented, at various points in times when their state legislatures chose not to send anyone to Congress. In fact, while one of the major criticisms of the Articles of Confederation was that they failed to deal with crises like Shays' Rebellion, the simple reality was that even if the Articles had enough power to put down Shays' Rebellion, which they didn't because they couldn't tax and they couldn't build a standing army, they wouldn't have legitimately been able to do a single thing about it because there weren't even enough representatives present at the time to issue any sort of orders, to have any sort of binding act of government. The whole thing, the whole Articles of Confederation government, not just Shays' Rebellion, but the whole governmental structure, was a mess. And the one slight glimmer of success that they had was that they were able to settle a few small land disputes between states. The articles, which I'm going to expect that you remember from and remember the weaknesses of from both the textbook and from your time last year with Mr. Lekovich, were the product of their time period, the product of rebelling against strong British rule, which consequently then leads to a weak system of government. In fact, channeling the weak system of government from the 1740s that the colonists so desperately wanted back. But it became clear after a dozen years that the salutary neglect that the colonies had enjoyed under British rule up until the 1750s wasn't a long-term governmental solution. We couldn't salutarily neglect our own governmental needs. We needed something stronger, and that's the context for the Constitutional Convention. After the failed Annapolis Convention, Shays' Rebellion reinforced that stronger government was needed to protect the interests of the existing social order. We'll get to that convention coming up in class, and we'll discuss whose interests it advanced starting tomorrow.